The most revealing thing about betrayal is not always the lie itself. It is what the liar does once the lie is no longer enough. That is when you learn whether they merely failed you or whether they intend to conquer the meaning of what happened afterward. Some people do not stop at deception. They move on to authorship. They begin editing memory, reassigning motive, softening sequence, trimming away their own selfishness and enlarging your imperfections until the whole relationship can be retold in a version that flatters them. That is a deeper arrogance than cheating. It is not only disloyal. It is imperial. It says, "Not only will I wound you, I will decide what the wound means." That was the part one had not prepared for. For most of my adult life, I believed truth had a structural advantage over performance. I thought if a man stayed calm, spoke carefully, and refused to turn private pain into public theater, then reality would eventually sort itself into something recognizable without his needing to force it. That was one of my blind spots. Another was more flattering, which usually makes it harder to detect. I believed that because I was not reactive, I was therefore hard to manipulate. In reality, quiet men are often the easiest people to manipulate once someone learns that our conscience is stronger than our appetite for spectacle. We hesitate. We review ourselves. We worry about fairness. We want to be certain before we become severe. And while we are doing all of that, someone with less discipline and more narrative ambition can move a great deal of dishonesty through the room. My name is Peter Holloway. I'm 49 years old, and until a little over a year ago I had been married for 16 years to a woman named Elise. We lived outside Chicago in a neighborhood full of brick colonials, narrow shade trees, tasteful renovations, and the kind of domestic presentation that makes people assume maturity has solved more than it actually has. We had one daughter in college and a son finishing high school. I worked in procurement compliance for a national laboratory supply company, which meant vendor contracts, audit exposure, pricing controls, regulatory documentation, and all the quiet structures that keep more theatrical people from calling avoidable failure unexpected complexity. I liked that work because it rewarded sequence and punished vanity eventually. If something was wrong, it was wrong whether or not the meeting about it went well. If a system had been weakened, it would expose itself under pressure. I trusted that. At home, I trusted language more than I should have. Elise worked in executive communications for a private arts foundation. She was bright, socially fluid, emotionally articulate, and very skilled at presenting impulse as intuition. When we met, I found that attractive. I was steadier, more measured, less interested in impression as an art form. She brought movement into my life. I brought structure into hers. For a while, that seemed not only true but healthy. She made things feel vivid. I made them hold. That is how many marriages begin before time teaches each person whether they actually respect the thing they initially found balancing. I do not want to insult our early years by pretending they were fraudulent. They were not. There was real tenderness between us. Real loyalty too for a long stretch. We built a family. We made it through one brutal year when my company restructured and her mother got sick in the same season. We sat through emergency room visits, school meetings, funeral receptions, broken pipes, money stress, and the 1,000 ordinary humiliations that separate grown intimacy from romantic performance. All of that matters to me because betrayal lands differently when it grows inside something that once genuinely deserved your faith. If I am going to tell this honestly, I have to admit where I made myself easier to underestimate. I was too proud of being steady. Not loud pride. Quiet male pride. The kind that says, I don't need applause for carrying what matters. I handled the taxes, the retirement allocations, the college accounts, the insurance folders, the contractor calls, the home maintenance calendar, the emergency reserve, the healthcare paperwork, the mortgage strategy, the passwords, the invisible machinery of adult life. I did not resent it. In fact, part of me enjoyed the competence of it. But usefulness, when offered reliably enough, starts disappearing into the background of other people's lives. They stop seeing it as effort. Then, if they are vain enough, they begin regarding the person providing it as a fixed resource rather than a thinking man making disciplined choices. Elise used to call me grounding. Later she called me safe. Later still, in a tone I don't think she even recognized as contemptuous, she began calling me predictable. That shift matters. Predictable sounds harmless until you understand the hierarchy hiding inside it. I was no longer the husband whose stability made a life possible. I had become the husband whose stability could be contrasted with more exciting energies elsewhere. Once that happens in a marriage, the danger is no longer simply distance. The danger is reinterpretation. The first real change was not another man. It was how Elise began treating her emotional states as more morally significant than mine. If she felt restless, that was meaningful. If I felt uneasy, that was stress. If she needed room, that was maturity. If I needed clarity, that was pressure. She started talking in the language of expansion, personal truth, authenticity, all the modern vocabulary people use when they want to make appetite sound philosophically superior to responsibility. At first I treated it as midlife drift, the ordinary turbulence of two adults who had spent too long being useful to too many other people. Looking back, I see something colder. She had begun preparing a moral frame in which her dissatisfaction would be elevated and my seriousness would be downgraded. That frame mattered later because it became the first draft of the rewritten story. The other man, eventually, had a name. His name was Darren. He was a campaign advisor attached to one of the Foundation's largest donor initiatives. Divorced, polished, older than Elise by a few years. The kind of man who had learned how to make women feel unusually understood by asking exactly one more thoughtful question than their husbands had energy left to ask on a Thursday. I met him twice. He was calm in the practiced way certain men become calm once they know enough of their identity has been externally validated that they no longer need to work very hard for initial admiration. Elise mentioned him often enough to matter and casually enough to sound innocent. Darren understood institutional politics better than anyone. Darren thought the board was timid. Darren had a real instinct for emotional truth, which struck me even then as the sort of sentence women say when they are already assigning significance beyond the stated context. But significance is not proof, and that was the problem. Nothing clear enough existed yet for me to act without feeling I had degraded myself into suspicion. So I did what serious people often do too long. I waited for clarity. In the meantime, the house changed. Her phone acquired emotional density. That is the best way I can describe it. Not secrecy in the childish sense. Not locking screens and dashing to the bathroom. More like a new center of gravity had formed around it. She carried it differently. Looked at it differently. The face she made when reading certain messages belonged to a life that no longer fully involved me. I noticed. I also noticed how quickly she started calling me anxious or controlling whenever I asked simple questions about timing, money, or missing detail. That accusation matters because it became one of the first tools she used to make my attention itself look like the problem. If I asked why a donor dinner ended near midnight on a Wednesday, I was counting her movements. If I pointed out that a hotel charge on the joint card didn't align with the event venue she described, I was turning adulthood into surveillance. Once, when I asked why she seemed more emotionally available to her phone than to our dinner table, she said, "Not everything is about your need to know what's happening." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it hurt, though it did. Because it revealed something essential. She had begun treating truth as a privilege she distributed rather than as a shared condition of marriage. I should have understood what that meant much sooner. Instead, I did what quiet men too often do. I reviewed myself. Was I too rigid? Too structured? Too dependent on order? Was I mistaking her need for space as a personal threat because I prefer clarity? This is how manipulation works on conscientious people. It doesn't have to persuade you that the liar is innocent. It only has to persuade you that your own perception might be morally suspect. Then came the social shift. At first it was subtle. A friend asking me at a fundraiser if I was doing okay, in a tone that suggested my internal life had recently become public conversation. A neighbor mentioning that Elise had been under a lot of emotional strain. One of her colleagues, after 2 glasses of wine at a museum dinner, saying, "I hope things get easier at home," in the careful tone people use when they think they are being compassionate toward the difficult spouse without saying it directly. That is when I realized the lie was no longer just private. A narrative had begun circulating. I was the problem. Not dramatically. She was too sophisticated for dramatic. The story was more efficient than that. Peter's been under pressure. Peter has gotten very rigid lately. Peter doesn't handle emotional nuance well. Peter needs certainty all the time. Peter can be hard to reach unless everything is orderly. The genius of those lines is that each contains a recognizable piece of me, softened and turned one notch darker. That is how reputations get rewritten without anyone needing to invent a cartoon villain. You just take truth-adjacent traits and recontextualize them until a man's seriousness becomes his social liability. The first time I understood the scale of it, I was at dinner with two couples we'd known for years. One of the women, Karen, asked me privately in the powder room hallway whether I was getting support. I remember staring at her because the phrase was so loaded it required prior storytelling to make sense. I asked, "Support for what?" She looked embarrassed and said, "I just know Elise has been carrying a lot." There it was. That was the moment I understood I had not only been betrayed, I had been preemptively framed. Driving home that night, I realized something I should have seen earlier. The affair and the story about me were not separate problems. They were the same structure. She was not simply hiding another relationship. She was preparing the emotional environment in case the truth emerged. If people already saw me as rigid, controlling, emotionally difficult, then her betrayal could be reinterpreted later as the sad but understandable consequence of being married to me. That is not confusion. That is strategy. The actual discovery came a few weeks later through the kind of practical carelessness liars make once they have grown too comfortable with the story protecting them. I handled our taxes, so most financial documents still passed through a shared digital folder. One Saturday morning I was pulling medical expense statements when I found a mislabeled PDF in a folder called Campaign Planning. It was a confirmation for a weekend reservation at a boutique inn in Wisconsin. 2 nights, king suite, spa package, dinner reservation included. Not a work retreat. Not a board gathering. Just 2 adults building intimacy under a private name. Darren's email signature appeared in the forwarded chain. I was less shocked than I might have expected. When suspicion has already lived in the house long enough, proof does not arrive like lightning. It arrives like a lock finally turning. I did not confront her then. That mattered. Because by then I understood the problem was not only the relationship with Darren. It was the attempted authorship of our marriage itself. If I confronted her from shock, she would still control the language. She would cry, narrow, contextualize, accuse me of violating privacy, and perhaps worst of all, continue using the version of me she had already sold to other people as a way to explain why she had needed emotional refuge elsewhere. No. I wanted sequence. Paper. Timing. Messages. Not because I am a cold man. Because enough of my life had already been interpreted through her convenience. So I stayed quiet. This time, silence was not patience. It was evidence gathering. I reviewed statements, reimbursements, ride shares, calendar overlaps, and one old shared tablet she had forgotten still synced certain message previews when connected to the house Wi-Fi. I did not need every explicit sentence. In some ways, what mattered more was the tone, the warmth, the private planning, the references to how difficult I had become. The lines where Darren reassured her that she deserved a softer life. That phrase disgusted me because it was built on the version of me she had been crafting for months. I was not being replaced merely by another man. I was being replaced by a story in which my moral seriousness had become the burden justifying her disloyalty. I met with an attorney named Margaret Keene before I said a word. Late 60s, exact, dry, unmoved by fashionable self-explanations. I laid out the affair, the document trail, the messages, and the fact that she had apparently been softening my reputation socially in advance. Margaret listened and then said, "She's not just leaving the marriage. She's trying to leave with innocence." That was exactly right. Innocence. Or at least plausible moral superiority. Once I understood that, I changed. Not in some dramatic, cinematic way. I still made dinner. Still showed up at family obligations. Still paid the mortgage. Still sat across from her at breakfast and discussed our son's college visits. But I stopped explaining myself. Stopped seeking clarity from her. Stopped defending my seriousness or correcting the little insinuations she dropped about my stress, my rigidity, my emotional density. I remained courteous, present, and exact. But I no longer participated in the old arrangement where she could make an accusation and rely on me to produce 5 paragraphs of careful self-examination in response. That disturbed her more than direct anger would have. One night she said, "You've become really cold." I said, "No. I've become less available for editing." That line landed because it named the thing she was actually doing. Not only lying. Editing. Reframing. Rearranging the moral order. The turning point came when she decided to formalize the rewritten story. We were in the living room. Late evening. Our son upstairs. She had come home from a strategy dinner and found me sitting quietly with a folder on the coffee table. She took one look at it and instead of asking what it was, said, "If this is another attempt to make everything my fault, I'm not doing it." That sentence mattered because it revealed how committed she already was to the alternate script. Even then, with the evidence in front of us, she needed the frame to survive one more minute. I opened the folder. The reservation. The messages. The ride shares. The account movements. The draft petition. And because it mattered just as much to me, screenshots of the message threads where she described me to Darren as emotionally punishing, obsessed with control, and someone who makes honesty feel unsafe. Those lines, more than the affair itself, made my stomach go still, because they were not only private venting, they were narrative preparation. They were the written proof that she had been actively rewriting our marriage story in parallel with betraying it. She looked at the pages and said nothing for several seconds. Then came the first instinct of people like her. "How long have you been going through my things?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I lied." Not, "This is worse than I admitted." Sequence first. Method first. The moral offense in her mind was still my access to the truth rather than her effort to reshape it. I said, "Long enough to know the affair is only half of what you've done." She tried then, of course. The usual sequence. It was emotional before it was physical. Darren understood parts of her she had lost in our marriage. She had been lonely. She hadn't known how to talk to me because I always needed things defined too sharply. Some of that may even have contained pieces of truth. Affairs often do. The betrayer is not always lying about being unhappy. They are lying about what their unhappiness entitles them to do and say. Then I asked the only question that mattered. When did you decide you needed to turn me into the problem before you could live with what you were doing? That was the moment the truth was fully revealed. Not just that she had another man. Not just that she had lied. The deeper truth was that she had not trusted her own behavior to stand on its own moral legs. She knew, somewhere, that what she was doing would look like betrayal if seen clearly. So she began adjusting the light around me first. If I became controlling, heavy, emotionally unsafe, then her second relationship could become refuge instead of infidelity. That was the real architecture of the lie. She didn't answer well. There was no good answer available. She said she had needed someone to understand how unhappy she was. She said she had only been trying to explain context. She said I had become impossible to talk to. All of it sounded smaller once the messages were on paper because paper is merciless with tone. What looks like emotional nuance in a live conversation often looks like simple self-serving narrative once printed in sequence. I said, "You didn't just betray the marriage. You tried to rewrite me." That was the cleanest sentence I spoke in the whole collapse. The divorce was not dramatic. It was administrative, painful, careful, and ordinary in the way serious adult endings usually are. Assets, schedules, tuition, disclosures, the house, our son, who understood more than we wanted him to and less than he deserved. Darren faded faster than I expected, which did not surprise me in the end. Secondary relationships often live on contrast. Once the marriage ends and ordinary daylight enters, contrast loses its glamour. What took longer to repair was not my heartbreak. It was the distortion. The feeling of realizing that for months, maybe longer, she had been quietly moving pieces into place so that if I ever spoke the truth, it would collide first with a softened, compromised version of me in other people's minds. That is a hard thing to recover from because it makes you doubt not only your marriage but your social reality. Who heard what? Who believed it? Who looked at you through her language before ever asking their own questions? A few people apologized later. In the careful way adults apologize when they know they participated passively in someone else's misrepresentation. Not many. Most people prefer the social convenience of not revisiting the moral errors that made them comfortable at the time. I don't resent that now. Resentment is too expensive to keep once the truth has already done its work. About a year after the divorce, Elise said something to me while we were waiting outside our son's orientation meeting. I didn't think the messages would matter that much. That sentence told me she still had not fully understood. It wasn't that there was another man, I said. It was that you needed me smaller to make him seem justified. She looked away then. Not ashamed exactly. Just finally unable to avoid the shape of what she had done. If there is any message worth carrying from my story, it is this. When someone starts trying to retell your marriage before it is even ended, pay attention. Affairs are painful. Lies are painful. But the attempt to rewrite the moral record is something else. It means the person is no longer merely failing you in private. They are trying to leave with a cleaner conscience than the truth would allow, and they need your character bent to fit that exit. That is why evidence matters. Not because screenshots and receipts are romantic. Not because messages bring closure. They don't. But because memory becomes very fragile once a skilled liar begins editing the past in real time. Evidence does not heal you. It protects reality long enough for you to stop apologizing for seeing it. And once reality is protected, the truth no longer has to win. It simply has to remain itself long enough for the false story